Well, thank you. It's good to be here. This is a topic that I very much enjoy. In fact, my PhD dissertation was on a very similar topic to this one. You probably know the Bible starts with the verse, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." And the question is, what do astronomers today say about the origin of the universe? And is there a conflict here with the biblical affirmation of God as creator? A thesis I want to advance is that the Big Bang actually accords well with God as creator. And a second thesis is the origin of the universe remains a serious problem for the naturalist. The naturalist is a person who believes the physical universe is all that exists. And the argument will basically run as follows. There's two possibilities. The universe had a beginning, or the universe didn't have a beginning. And by the way, universe here isn't just necessarily our Big Bang. There could be more than one Big Bang, but the universe is the whole of the physical universe. And next, my contention is either way, the origin of the universe is a problem for the naturalist. I want to say a couple things about standard Big Bang theory. Our universe sprang into being about 13.7 billion years ago, with time and space itself coming into being at that time. Galaxies and stars formed, initially just from hydrogen and from helium. And all the heavier elements were formed in stars and then spread across the galaxies through supernova explosions, these exploding stars. Our star, the Sun, with its planetary system, was formed after that. I want to insert here, it's not part of the standard Big Bang theory, but most physicists think within the very first fraction of a second, the universe expanded enormously to a size far greater than our whole visible universe, all within a very fraction of a second, and that's known as inflation. So the question, beginning or no beginning? So what caused the Big Bang? Some people will say you can't ask what caused the Big Bang because there's no time before the Big Bang. So you can rephrase the question by simply asking what explains why the Big Bang happened. And standard scientific explanations don't apply. Your standard scientific explanation looks at prior states of affairs, and then it brings in laws of physics and says, given the prior state of affairs plus laws of physics, that explains what we want to explain. But obviously, if you start talking about how the universe started, you can't use a standard scientific explanation to account for that. Also, when I was talking about the Big Bang, standard Big Bang theory actually breaks down at the very minute fraction of a second at the moment of the Big Bang, because then you enter the quantum world. It's a quantum space, quantum time, and general relativity simply doesn't apply at that level. What we need is a quantum theory of gravity to be able to describe what actually happens in that first fraction of a second at the moment of the Big Bang. We don't have that. So this leaves open the possibility that time might not actually have started at the Big Bang. That there may have been time prior to the Big Bang because we actually don't know what exactly was happening at the moment of the Big Bang. Stephen Hawking gives a proposal in A Brief History of Time which actually doesn't fit either in the category of the universe had a beginning or it didn't have a beginning, but I'll set that aside and come back to that at the end if there is time. First of all, what about the proposal that the universe had a beginning? The standard Big Bang theory says the universe started at that point. One proposal is say there's actually no explanation needed at all. I think most physicists say no. If the Big Bang happened, we have to give some kind of explanation for it. So I'm not going to say more about that, but there have been a couple of philosophers who said no explanation is needed at all. The more common explanation is to say that the Big Bang was a quantum event. And quantum events don't have to be caused. Since they don't have to be caused, maybe the Big Bang itself was simply a quantum event. And part of what motivates this is that we think of empty space really is not empty space. In empty space, there are particle-antiparticle pairs that pop into existence and then go out of existence. They pop into existence and then annihilate themselves all more quickly, too quickly for us even to be able to observe them. Theoretically, we cannot even observe these events, but collectively we have very good reason for believing that you actually do have these events taking place that seem to be utterly uncaused. There's a background energy in the empty space, and these particle-antiparticle pairs pop in and out of existence. Maybe the universe was like this. It just popped into existence in that way. A problem is that you can't get something from absolutely nothing. So there are physicists who have used the theological expression creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. But when they talk about the Big Bang being created out of nothing, they don't mean absolutely nothing. They think there's a reality that physics described, and out of this reality you can get this quantum event taking place. But obviously, if physics applies to it, the state of affairs out of which the Big Bang arose, that's not absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing is not characterized by anything. So those who say the universe was created out of nothing typically don't mean absolutely nothing. A second problem is that quantum mechanics calculates using probabilities. But without space and time, probability, it seems to me, has no meaning whatsoever. I mean, how can you take quantum mechanics and somehow make modifications on it and have it apply when there's no space and no time at all? Seems to me the concept of probability simply does not apply in that context. There are quite a few physicists, perhaps even a majority, I'm not sure what percentages these days, who think the Big Bang was not the absolute beginning of the universe. One proposal, initial proposal, was that maybe the universe is in a steady state, with the universe expanding and matter being created in this empty space. However, that theory had predictions, and those predictions weren't borne out. So it's one of the scientific theories that we can reject now because evidence has shown that it's not correct. Another possibility is the universe goes through cycles. And the original view of this was a universe expanding right now. Maybe the expansion would slow down and would come back together in a big crunch. So you have Big Bang, Big Crunch. And then perhaps the universe has always existed that way. The problem with the Big Bang, Big Crunch theory is that within the last 20 years, they've realized that the rate of expansion is actually increasing, not decreasing. And there doesn't seem to be anything in physics which is going to reverse this increase in expansion, so a Big Crunch does not seem possible. There is, however, a theory that comes from physicist Paul Steinhardt based on string theory. And his idea is the universe expands and the mass density of the universe gets less and less. There are two elements within string theory, in addition to the little strings that are the particles. There are membranes, or branes they call them. And his thesis is that when the universe gets thin enough, that there's low enough mass, energy density, that these two membranes, which permeate the whole universe, will collide. And when they collide, you'll have another Big Bang. By the way, interesting enough, if he's right, then there's no need for inflation. This discussion about Antarctica and observing the cosmos, and then they had to back off from that, saying, well, we're a little too early on that. So Steinhardt's speculation is still viable. But if it's viable, then if it's correct, then there's no need for inflation. A second problem has to do with the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says with an enclosed system, over time the amount of usable energy decreases. Or entropy is a matter of disorder. So as time progresses, a closed system has less and less usable energy. Disorder increases. Things move towards a static equilibrium where no work can be done. The problem is if you have a cycle, one Big Bang leading to the next, you have no energy input from outside. So how is it that each cycle starts off with suddenly this drop in entropy? And it's worth noting that in these cycles, even if the laws of physics change, the second law of physics is not dependent upon the values of the physical constants. The second law of physics only depends on the idea that there are more ways in which the universe can be disordered than ordered. So it seems as though no matter what physics comes out of each cycle, the second law of thermodynamics is still going to hold. So to say that there's an exception to the second law of thermodynamics is saying there's an exception to something which is very well grounded in contemporary Lee Schmolin. It suggests every time there's a black hole actually opens up to a white hole on the other side. And in fact, it opens up to a Big Bang on the other side. They wouldn't be as big as ours if it's just sort of normal black holes that we see around us. But he says every black hole gives rise to another Big Bang. Another possibility of branching universes by Russian physicists been living in California for a long time now, Andrei Lin. And he suggests that we have our universes like a bubble, and pinching off of this bubble are other bubbles. So you have big bangs that are like bubbles that pinch off of our universe, and we keep multiplying that way. A problem, however, with both of these, again, is the second law of thermodynamics. If you have a bubble pinching off of our universe, how is it that you get going into a black hole, you have exceedingly high entropy, but coming out the other side, you have very low entropy? A black hole has a very high degree of entropy, so how is it you have low entropy coming out the other side? So there doesn't seem to be any explanation for that. However, one proposal has been given, Victor Stenger, in a book called Not by Design, proposed that at the moment of the Big Bang, our universe actually had maximum amount of entropy. But when inflation took place and space expanded, his suggestion was the ceiling for entropy rose greatly, and ever since we've been our entropy has been rising to catch up with it. So that's his explanation. Roger Penrose, some of you may be familiar with him, Emperor's New Mind, both a physicist and mathematician, says this, Victor Stenger's position, he doesn't actually mention Victor Stenger, but he suggests this possibility, and he says it simply won't work. And I'm not enough of a physicist to know why why Roger Penrose says it won't work. But he is a very preeminent physicist. He, along with Stephen Hawking, came up with what are called the singularity theorems. So he says that it won't work. In fact, he gives a calculation on the probability of our universe starting off with extremely low entropy. Entropy is always probabilistic, so you can, by luck, have things be ordered. But to start off with our universe having as low entropy as would be required to see the amount of entropy we have right now, the calculation that he gave for that was 1 over 10 to the 10th power, and then that exponent raised to the 120th power. It's one of the smallest or hugest numbers, depending which way you look at it, I've ever seen anybody propose that had any physical significance to it whatsoever. Now, Roger Penrose is not a theist. His conclusion of this is to say, well, there must be some unknown law of physics that simply dictates the Big Bang start off with very low entropy. We have nothing within physics to back that up, but that's his proposal. There must be some explanation for it. By the way, for those who are familiar with multiple universes, a person might say, well, if we have an infinite number of universes, then even that absurd probability is still going to happen. And we have to be in a universe that has that absurdly low probability. Of course, we're in that kind of universe. If you want, in Q&A, I'll come back to that. But my suggestion is that's actually an explanation which works, but it's an explanation which one should appeal to as a last alternative, even if one is a naturalist. Okay, conclusion. Whether the universe had a beginning or not, the origin of the universe remains a serious problem for naturalism. And second, theism accords well with an absolute beginning to the physical universe. In fact, when the steady-state theory first came out, there were a number of people who were proponents of it who said that part of the reason for it was the Big Bang sounded too much like Genesis 1. It sounded too much like an absolute beginning of the universe. And as atheists, they couldn't believe there was an absolute beginning of the universe, so they came up with this steady-state theory. And I don't know what percentages are, but I think increasingly physicists are saying surely that the Big Bang was not just the beginning of the universe. But obviously, a Big Bang does fit with what's described in Genesis 1, let there be light, and there was light. Okay, next, I want to make a couple comments. One, this universe seems to be fine-tuned when it comes to the basic physical constants. The values of the basic physical constants seem fine-tuned for the possibility of complex, organized physical structures. Now, the physical constants are those numbers which underlie physics. The gravitational constant, the electromagnetic constant, the strength of the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the masses of different subatomic particles. All those things are fundamental physical constants. At this point, there's no theory that says why they have to have the values they have. We just discover those, and then we use those to do our calculations. But physicists over the last 30 years have done a variety of calculations and suppose that this physical constant or that physical constant had a little bit different value. Let's run calculations and see what the universe would look like. And in many instances, we have a universe where there are no complex structures at all. So even if one says, well, maybe life could be very different like we imagine it, I think it's reasonable to say complex life requires complex structure. Intelligent life requires complex structure. So if you have no complex structure, you can't have intelligent life. Stephen Hawking, in Brief History of Time, writes, "The laws of science, as we know them at present, contain many fundamental numbers, like the size of the electric charge of the electron, and the ratio of the masses of the proton and the electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life." Again, Stephen Hawking is not a theist. He's one who appeals to the multiverse. So when it comes to exceedingly small fine-tuning, he says there must be an infinite universe. In an infinite universe, things have to turn out right somewhere, and we are in such a universe. Another thing that's worth noting is that our universe obviously is a universe that can give rise to conscious beings like ourselves. And the question is, how can mindless physics, however you configure this physics, how is it ever going to give rise to experiences? So how do you account for an experience of pain, which seems to be different than pain behavior itself, or simply the neural firings that take place when I'm experiencing pain? And even if you knew exactly what was happening in the brain when I experience pain, how is it these neurons in this configuration actually give rise to a feeling of pain? And even if one says mysteriously it does, it seems as though the feeling of pain actually has some survival value. But if it has survival value, it must have some causal effect. So if the feeling is just somehow mysteriously arising out of this complex neural structure, it doesn't seem as though it would have any causal power to it. If it has causal power to it, then one has to have some kind of metaphysics. Metaphysics and philosophy is the way in which you understand the nature of the world around us. Thomas Nagel, who's a prominent atheist, came out with a book in 2012 entitled Mind and Cosmos, and the controversial part was this subtitle. It says, "Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false." Now, most atheists I know are convinced that naturalism is almost certainly true, and that's part of the reason why they dismiss religion in general, and Christianity in particular, because we believe there's something beyond the physical world. It's a very well-argued book. None of the arguments depend on religious beliefs. He's really looking for something between theism and naturalism. He says there has to be something within the natural world, not supernatural, but within the natural world, this explains why mind arises. There had to be something like mind within nature itself. And he proposes there must be something like a natural teleology, where things are striving towards end within nature itself. I look at that and I say, is that really more reasonable than theism? That says there's something like mind behind the universe, and that explains why it is that mind can arise within the universe. I have a minute here, so let me say something about Stephen Hawking's proposal. He suggests that time does not stretch infinitely in the past, and yet he says there was no beginning to the universe. All right? He says when you get time approaching zero, so we go backwards in time to the Big Bang, when it gets close to zero, the time dimension actually becomes exactly like a spatial dimension. And the way in which he describes that is like a globe. If you're moving north, there's sort of curvature of the Earth, but when you get to the North Pole, you don't come to an edge. Rather, it simply goes down on the other side. So he suggests that t equals 0 is like the point at the top of the North Pole, and there's no beginning to time. Now, to explain this, he actually thinks that the past, the present, and the future are all equally real. Whereas most of us think, no, the future is not as real as the past and the present. It hasn't come about yet. But he contends the future is as real as the past and the present is, and our sense, the future is actually, the time is actually moving in a direction, he suggests in that book, is an illusion. He also buys into what's called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Namely, not only is our universe like a globe. By the way, it would only be a globe if you had a big bang at the top and a big crunch at the bottom. But it'd be a static given. If you don't have a big crunch, then we have some other shape that sweeps out infinitely. But nonetheless, on his view, he thinks all quantum possibilities are actualized. So you not only have one ball, but you have this near infinite number of geometrical configurations that are branching off from one another, but it's all a static given. When I look at that, I say, does the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics make sense to me? I say, no, it doesn't. When it comes to the idea that somehow the direction of time is simply an illusion, I say it doesn't make sense to me that it is, because in this temporal dimension you still have entropy sort of progressing along this dimension. But why is it that entropy would increase along this dimension if there's no direction of time? I mean, after all, it seems as though things move in a direction of disorder because there's more ways it can move that way, but if there's no direction of time, then it seems to me that having entropy follow the time dimension that way doesn't make sense. But I threw Hawking's in because he is kind of an outlier. Most physicists don't buy into his proposal, but because he is the great Stephen Hawking and the movie came out just on his biography, I thought I should say something about that. Okay, let me open to questions from you. Yes?
So, are you making a case for believing in God then, by representation?
All I'm doing is I'm saying that if one looks at the question of the origin of the universe, and one asks the question, should we expect, from a physical naturalist point of view, we're going to come up with some natural explanation, that's a faith statement. Very much a faith statement. Given it's not only a matter we don't know what the scientific answer is yet, to come up with an answer we're going to have to assume that something that seems so well entrenched within physics as the second law of thermodynamics has to have a major exception when it comes to any Big Bang. And that is a major exception to assume that science will come up with at this point. So it doesn't prove that God exists. It simply says when Christians say that God brought the universe into being, that's not so crazy. It's not crazy at all from a scientific standpoint. And from a scientific standpoint, when you have people appealing to an infinite number of universes to explain what we have right now, that's a stretch. Another person here. Yes?
Yeah, I have a theory about no, I have a question about the theory itself. So, I mean, one of the fundamental parts of the theory is redshift. It's a measure of distance.
Right, right.
But Russ's astronomer, Halton R, he did a lot of research, and he discovered actually several cases where you have two objects, usually a quasar close to a galaxy, and they'd be connected through some kind of galactic jet, yet they'd have widely different redshifts.
Yeah, so the question is about redshift. One of the reasons why people think the Big Bang happened, that the universe is expanding, is that when you look out at the galaxies, the light is shifted in the red direction. So if a source of light is moving away from it, it stretches the wavelengths, and it stretches light in the red direction. If it's moving towards us, it compacts the wavelengths and moves things in the blue direction. And so the contention was there's actually some evidence to say that that doesn't always work out. If we're only the redshift, then I think one could say, okay, well maybe that's not the case. There are a couple other things which do fit with it. One is the amount of helium and hydrogen that we observe in our universe matches what calculations would give, given the energy, the content that would have to be present in the Big Bang. So we actually see hydrogen and helium in a proportion that matches what the theory says for the Big Bang. Another thing is that the theory says that within a short time after the Big Bang, when the universe had gotten thin enough, then light could travel freely. And light traveling freeway is that sort of borderline, which is the background radiation, the cosmic background radiation, which there was back in the past, not too long ago, they're looking at that and realizing there are slight variations within the cosmic background radiation, enough to cause the formation of galaxies. So it's really all three of those together. And to challenge the Big Bang theory, one has to challenge all three of those. And as a Christian, I'm open to other alternatives. But at the same time, as I look at what the Scripture says, maybe that's part of the question, does the Scripture actually commit us to a young Earth view rather than old Earth view? I could talk some about that. Maybe people have some other questions first about this before we got onto that. Here, I'll come back to that, yes.
Do you know anything about this Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem? Did you ever refer to that in your reasoning?
The Guth, what is the theorem?
It's called Borg-Guth-Vilenkin.
Yeah, well, Vilenkin was, okay, I know who he is and I know who Guth is, but what's the theory basically?
No, they had some kind of theorem which shows that the universe has to have a beginning if it's on average expanding, something like that.
Yeah, I think they're talking about our Big Bang. I mean, so we have to go back. So that would be another argument saying the Big Bang actually happened.
Yeah.
But saying the Big Bang happened, the people who think that time didn't actually begin then, they grant the Big Bang happened, but they say the Big Bang wasn't the absolute beginning. There were things that led into that. Either a black hole led into it, or there's some sort of cyclical view or something like that. Yes? Here.
Yes, you say that in Genesis 1, light, or God created the universe and there was light. But I mean, there are also other statements in the Bible, like the earth is 6,000 years old, and other claims which have been proven wrong. I mean, you pick out one statement that might actually collide with, or be true, or not interfering with the science, but the other statements are clearly wrong, or what is your view on that?
Yeah, the calculation of the universe is 6,000 years old.
Yeah.
Assumes that when you go through the genealogy, that there are no gaps in the genealogy. But they've actually discovered in the ancient Near East genealogies in other places like Egypt, where they have the same kind of way of stating it. The person lived at such age, gave birth to such a person, and then that person gave birth to, and you have it like that. But we actually discover is that sometimes the person that's listed is a great-grandson, rather than immediate descendant. So there can be gaps within the genealogy. If one takes a young Earth position, one would say, well, surely the examples we have are only a few generations. So young Earth people would be quite content to say maybe the universe was 10,000 years old, rather than 6,000 years old. But I say that since we don't know how large these gaps may have been, there's nothing that prohibits them from being huge rather than small, even though the examples that we have are relatively small gaps. The other question is in terms of days. Is it 6 24-hour days? Or are those periods of time, are there 24-hour days separated by long periods of time? I think there are several things within the Genesis count within itself that gives us reason for thinking that not everything is intended literally. So for instance, day 7 does not seem to be a 24-hour day. All the others say evening and morning, evening and morning, evening and morning, but there's no closure to the 7th day. So the 7th day is God's reign and continues to the present. In fact, in the ancient world, a king resting was not the king sleeping. Rather, so the king rested, the expression the king rested meant that he no longer had to fear enemies on his border. So God is establishing his regular rule. And Genesis 1 seems to be saying God established on the 7th day, but there's no end to it. Plus, you have the sun, moon, and stars being created on day 4. And one needs to ask, did the ancient people actually think that you could have day and night, which is talked about in day 1, without the sun? I think given that ancient people, like us, would associate the rising of the sun with morning, there's likely poetry going on here. So how much is intended literally and how much is not intended literally is a wide open question. And it's interesting to me that people who assume it has to be literal are either the staunch atheists who are critics of Christianity, or the people who say it has to be absolutely literal, but the people who take literature seriously, and take ancient literature seriously, and ask how would they have understood it back then, they don't have this hard and fast way of approaching it, and there's quite a bit of range to say, well, we don't understand exactly what's going on here. But I think we can do, as a Christian, I'm committed to all the Scripture teaches, I can ask what is said elsewhere in Scripture, and then use that to try to figure out what is intended literally and what is not. So for instance, I'm committed to there actually being historical Adam and Eve. Whether that was 100,000 years ago, or when that was, I don't know. But I believe there was actually a historical Adam and Eve, and that God initiated a relationship with them, and that has continued to the present. There is the question of whether Adam and Eve could have had biological ancestors. And there's not a whole lot that one needs to change in one's interpretation of Genesis 1 to be open to that. I'm not saying that we should necessarily go that direction, but there's an increasing genetic case for saying that human beings really do have biological ancestry with chimpanzees. Given that, it seems as though Adam and Eve did have biological ancestors, and the one thing that seems to go against that in Genesis says God molded Adam out of the dust of the earth and breathed on him, and he became a living soul. Now, is that a figure of speech, or is that literally God making a clay statue and bringing it to life? One reason why you might think in the ancient world it was intended as a figure of speech was that nothing else is created that way. Plus, to breathe on it, God would literally have to take on a human form and to breathe. Otherwise, the breathe itself is God instilled life into it. So it doesn't take a whole lot to reinterpret, and not reinterpret in a way which is distorting what's actually there, but we're actually going back and asking, how would people have understood it back then? And that's a hard question. To go back to, say, a Babylonian priest and say, is everything in the Babylonian creation story intended literally? I don't know what he would answer. Yes?
Yeah, you could say that there was sort of prime mover, a God that created the universe, a deist statement.
Yeah, you can be a deist. The deist, God made the universe, got it going, has nothing to do with it afterwards.
Yeah.
Right.
And that has as much going for it as, like if I said, well, there's a celestial panda that created the universe and gives my life meaning, etc. But that's a deist statement. How do you go from there to the theist statement, where you have a God that's, you know, he's good and he cares for you and you have all these commandments for you? What is your source of information that I don't have?
Yeah, the only thing you have in this is it seems, given the fine-tuning, that whatever this designer of the universe was, the designer of the universe wanted to have sentient creatures arise eventually. That tells us a little bit. But it certainly doesn't give us a good God. It doesn't give us even necessarily an all-powerful God, even though it's a very powerful God to be able to create this. To get to a God who really cares about us, I think you have to ask, has God actually acted within history? And the Christian faith is really rested primarily on claims that God has acted in history, not the ways in which science fit within the Christian faith, but the ways in which God has shown his character to us in human history and the person of Jesus. Yeah, follow?
Yes, yeah. Fine-tuning thing, I mean, sure there are constants that, you know, are necessary for our existence, but if we look at, I mean, is it really that impressive that in the vast majority of the possible universes, a fraction can sustain life? I mean, is that just God showing off, or is he just incompetent in just creating that system? And
yeah, sometimes people say, why would God create such a vast universe if so little of it is habitable? I mean, after all, most of the universe is empty space, and creatures like us can't endure an empty space without a lot of extra technology. But it seems to me to say that's waste assumes that somehow there's a limited supply that God has. Or if God's going to create a universe, surely he wouldn't create one that has consistent laws of physics throughout. But if God creates a universe where there's consistent laws of physics throughout, I suspect that God could not create a universe that could sustain life like us and not have it be huge. Or even given the time from the Big Bang, it would have to be at least several billion years, I think, after the Big Bang to be able to support our existence in this world. So it's not wastefulness, I don't think, on God's part. Is that not the point?
no, sorry, just to clarify. If he is all-powerful and can create any universe he likes, then why create a system in which you have to be so exact on the constants?
Yeah, if God's going to, the question is God going to create a universe which is everything that's sort of manually done by him and there aren't any consistent laws of physics? Or is God can create a universe where there really is a consistent law of physics and it runs that way? Now, I'm not God, so I don't really answer that, but I have enough of an appreciation for people who make systems that work that at least it seems attractive to me, if I were God, and I'm not, to create a universe that actually has this coherence to it, where physics is able to accomplish the thing. So for instance, when a child is growing in a mother's womb, there are natural processes which are involved there. God doesn't have to supernaturally make I don't think God supernaturally has to make the gene become, or rather the cell divide and become just the right kind of cell in the right place, the right time. My assumption is there are natural things about the environment, chemistry, etc. like that cause genes to turn off and turn on and off at the right time in the right place. Now God being all-powerful surely could create a world where every time genes differentiate and a stem cell becomes, say, 2 nerve cells, God has to do an individual miracle to make that happen. Given there's no limits on God's power, he could do that. But at the same time, it doesn't seem to me as though an all-powerful God would choose to be a celestial mechanic on a massive scale, rather than creating a universe which is actually exceedingly well-ordered. Most people I know of who are Christians, who are in the sciences, part of what undergirds their faith is that, in fact, this world is amazingly well-ordered. And it points to them the glory of God. And the person say, well, where is God in that picture? Oftentimes the people assume that if we live in an exquisitely ordered world, then God can never act within it. So you have a closed system. This closed system, God can't do anything. But that's the mistake, what I call order of nature miracles, or gaps where God has to do things simply to sustain the order of nature, from miracles of history where God does miracles at particular points at particular times. So does God actually work in the human brain to cause me to have thoughts that I wouldn't otherwise have? It seems to me, from my experience and lots of people I've talked to, some things are just coincidence. But there are other things that strike me God actually can do that. There's nothing in physics that says God can't do that. It simply says this is the way things happen when nature is running it by itself. It doesn't say there can't be anything outside of physics that can have an influence upon that. And it doesn't say there's anything outside of physics that could bring about exceptions. To give an example, the laws of physics can explain to us, can tell us how human growth normally takes place, from conception on to when the baby's born. But that doesn't tell us at all whether or not the virgin birth took place. Now, the virgin birth was not a natural process. And even if you understood all the natural process, that wouldn't tell you whether or not God would make an exception. It would only tell you that if you knew that God didn't exist, or that such a being existed. He surely would not make an exception. But science doesn't do that. Science doesn't have that capacity. Okay, back here.
Last question.
Yes, okay, last question.
Okay. So I just run them by you quickly. There's a couple of them. First one is with the virgin birth. If someone would claim that today, you'd straightly like get a DNA test and see if they're telling the truth or not. So we can't be sure about that. But then there's also this thing about God and physics, and I do actually believe that. I don't believe in many things, but I do actually believe that it's not actually possible to dismiss the idea of God when you're talking physics, because most of the things, I mean, inflation is probably the thing closest to having maybe an evidence for its existence, I don't know. But most of the things you talk about today weren't actually even science, it's just theories of scientists. And it's like a misconception, because when you think of them as scientists, they also have these theories, but they have to be proven in order to become science. So I think they're absolutely maybe both as valid as each other, having God or having these kind of theories. I mean, they are more mathematical, but it doesn't make them any more true.
Yeah, there are lots of scientists, preeminent scientists, who are theists, who believe in God. And they don't see it as being common. Let me just say one comment and I'll conclude this. When a person says to me, "You're a Christian and you believe in the virgin birth of Jesus?" Really? What I respond to that is I say, from where you're coming from, since I'm assuming the person doesn't believe in God at all, you're perfectly justified in thinking that sounds absolutely ridiculous, and yes, you should dismiss it. I only believe it because of other things I've already come to believe. If you haven't already come to believe that God exists and a variety of other things leading up to that, then of course you're going to dismiss the virgin birth as being absolutely ridiculous. But suppose you come as far as saying that it actually makes some sense that Jesus is actually God revealed to us, that He is God incarnate, then the virgin birth, even though it's kind of crazy, is not unbelievable. Well, let me close at that. Thank you very much.